and I have the great privilege of introducing the three speakers, who are James Walters, Paul Grange, and Mike Wayne. I'll give a little bit of background on each of them before they start their papers. As always, we're going to take 20-minute papers, one after the other, and then open up for Q&A afterwards. Can I ask everyone to keep themselves muted and their camera off while the presentations go ahead, so that basically we have smaller bandwidth requirements? That'd be great. So we're going to start with James. James is a reader in film and television at Birmingham University, or University of Birmingham to be precise. He has a number of relatively recent books, one of which is on television performance with Lucy Fife Donaldson, and he also has a book on the thick of it. And Paul has just gushed about television performance, so I think that's definitely going to go onto my reading list. Though I have to say, the thick of it also sounds like a great book to read, simply because I love the thick of it. So, James, over to you.
There we are. Thank you so much, Elke. Okay, let me try and do the thing that I need to do, which is to share a screen. I think that should be working. And let's make that full screen. And there we are. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So today what I'm going to be talking about is teaching television to a large extent, and really the centrality of moments in our teaching of television, or in my teaching of television. I should sort of say, this doesn't sound like the greatest pitch for a conference paper. I'm not sure I'm saying anything particularly startling or original in what I'm presenting today. What I'd really intended to do was to reflect on things that I certainly do in my day-to-day life, and perhaps others do as well, and just think a little bit more about the way that we approach the teaching of television, and in line with the topic of the panel, some of the challenges and some of the ways that we work around those challenges. Okay, so there are challenges in teaching television, and it occurred to me, sort of looking at this panel and the things that other people were presenting on, that it's quite useful to talk about those challenges quite honestly, and to say that there are challenges, there are things that are difficult that we need to deal with and overcome. Television is an unwieldy text, and it comes in all shapes and sizes, and there are challenges that are associated with that. How do you fit those texts into the relatively short teaching sessions that we have in universities and colleges, for example? Then there's the question of which bits do we choose to fit into those teaching sessions? Are we expecting a class to have common knowledge of the show that we want to talk about in that short session? Do we need to do extra work to familiarize a class with that show or series of shows? Can we expect common knowledge in a multi-platform streaming television environment? Probably not, because there's so much for people to watch. It's impossible to think that everybody would watch the same things. Where to position yourself in relation to a show? Is there the danger of spoiling a show for somebody by choosing a section of it that comes at a later date, but is so crucial to the tone and texture of the show that you have to talk about it in your mind? There are dangers in disrupting and spoiling the viewing experience for people by wanting to do the thing that you want to do and that you want to talk about. And of course, there's the question of accessibility as well. Do our students, do our colleagues have access to the things that we want to talk about? How easy is that access? What kind of assumptions do we make about access that we might need to deal with? And then there's broader things. Is your institution equipped for teaching television from across all sorts of digital providers, for example? So is your institution set up for giving access to Netflix, Amazon, Sky, BBC, Channel 4, or is it more restricted than that? And if it's more restricted, are you in the situation where you're personally finding ways of making the content available to your students? And I think personally here might be a sort of euphemism for not necessarily legally finding ways of making content available to your students. And I think actually this is something that colleagues do regularly, is to use their own personal resources to make content available to students in the absence of institutional support for it. And given that television isn't restricted to terrestrial channels, free to view channels, I suspect that that practice is happening quite a lot in institutions where conscientious staff are finding ways to work around the restrictions that are placed upon them. So there's this set of challenges, and I've only listed some there. I'm sure that you can think of many others that might exist. Television's really exciting to teach, but it is difficult sometimes. And then there's this question of how to analyse television in class. Again, in these short sessions relatively short sessions that we have in universities. And my strategy, and I think this is a common strategy, is to narrow down in order to focus everybody together, to keep everybody in the conversation, to keep everybody included, and to keep that common focus that people can legitimately respond to and generate ideas from. One of the ways of doing that, of course, is to select an episode from something like a long-running drama, perhaps, or from a soap opera, or from television news, or from whatever it is that you're teaching, and to use that as the focal point within a class. And then, of course, that process of narrowing down again, selecting moments to focus on so that you've got something quite small, quite tight, quite coherent for students to respond to. And I've just given a couple of examples here of things that I've done with that in my own classes. So focusing in on moments from something like Happy Valley at the top, 24 at the bottom, which makes it look a bit like Kiefer Sutherland is really agonising on how to analyse television in class. He's not. It's an entirely different agony that he's experiencing. But I use those stills because there's a narrowing down into that moment, but actually in both of them there was a narrowing down into interior spaces that these characters were in. So I was sort of subconsciously physically narrowing the parameters as well as I was doing it. They're both sitting in cars in these two moments. And then once we've decided that we're going to sort of think about moments as a focal point, as something to grab onto, there are other questions that kind of spring out of that. And one of those is, well, what actually is a moment? What do we mean by that? It can sound like a really straightforward term because it's a common term that's in common usage. But like everything, it turns out to be quite complicated when you start thinking it through, particularly with that question of what constitutes a moment. It can be really short. A moment could just be a single freeze frame within a television program that you want to draw attention to for framing and for mise en scène and for visual composition, for example. Or it could be something longer. It can be a sequence. It can be an entire scene. The stretch within that term moment is quite considerable. It can be very, very small. It can be much, much larger comparatively. And I've used the example here on the slide of the recent BAFTA, British Academy Television Awards category for Moment of the Year. And I was really interested in this because what constituted a moment within these examples were really quite different from the breathtaking diversity performance that was the eventual winner from Britain's Got Talent, to Nigella pronouncing a funny word. Both legitimate moments, but very different moments in different contexts of television, and very different in terms of the idea of what a moment is and how it can resonate with audiences. The other thing that struck me, just as an aside about that awards, is the potential for spoilers. Bridgerton is there, and so is Mandalorian. Both of those moments even the visuals contain significant spoilers within them. And so this kind of misuse of television, I thought was quite interesting there, or abuse of television and the television moment. Anyway, that's a different matter. There's also this central tension in moments being both momentary and momentous, that moments can have huge significance, can have crucial significance for us, but they're also passing, they're fleeting, crucial but fleeting, moving away from us as we're trying to focus on them in the flow of television watching. And that's not something that's particular to television necessarily, but it's something that's observable in television and the wide span of television content that's available and that we engage with. And that's why I think that tension can be quite useful. It tells us something about television. It tells us something about the medium, that it is something that we can hold, that we can sort of hang on to and stay with, but that at the same time is always moving on, moving away from us, and to the extent that it can be gone and not revisited potentially in the way that perhaps other art forms are. So momentary and momentous are quite useful terms when we're thinking about looking at moments. Now, I also thought that some of us might teach film as well. And although this isn't absolutely the case whatsoever, in my experience, there's a convenience of film having a single text for teaching, or a single defined text within about 2 hours that you can screen and then use moments from. Whereas with television, often I'm finding that you've got hours and hours and hours of the text, and you've got multiple texts potentially that you're engaging with. And in my teaching and in another teaching that I've seen, there's this tendency to stick to a sort of beginning, middle and endness of teaching film moments that give shape to the text. And I've given given the example here on the slide of Citizen Kane, where somebody teaching that might reasonably start with the enigmatic opening, might move through a sequence from the middle that's equally enigmatic, and then finish with a similarly enigmatic and iconic moment from the film, which is the closing sequence. And that retains the shape of the text. It keeps that narrative structure, and it gives shape to the film through the use of moments. And that, as far as I've seen over the years, is quite a standard way of approaching moments in film teaching. And then it occurred to me it's something that I do in television teaching as well, quite often, that I'm retaining the beginning, middle, endness in television teaching. And my Citizen Kane equivalent here is a show that I still teach, Wife Swap, from years ago, that I use when I'm talking about reality television. And I looked at the sequences that I actually use when I'm teaching it, and I've tried to, subconsciously tried to keep that narrative shape. Here's the opening, here's something from the middle, here's the ending, here's the resolution. And obviously I'm adhering to a kind of Todorov structure of narrative here. But it's interesting that something that happens in film teaching transfers itself across to television teaching as well, which makes sense because of the way that narrative structures work. Now, obviously, that's not quite so easy to do for television texts that have a beginning from many, many years ago, or that might not have that kind of clear, defined ending in the same way. So using moments in teaching can place a burden on those moments. They can sometimes be taken as representative as the text as a whole, used to encapsulate aesthetic or thematic interests, for example. And for long spanning shows, that burden can be intensified, with many hours potentially resting on a small section of content. And I've used the example here of Orange is the New Black, which I teach. And the kind of pressure and difficulty in selecting a moment from that show to illustrate what I want to say about that show is really, really difficult. And the still that I've included here is a moment that I think is very significant and important. But of course, were I to show it in class, would spoil a lot of the content for a class if they hadn't seen the entire show. as it comes quite late in the series run. Now, what I wanted to do is to focus some of this very briefly on a short clip, and I've chosen a clip from the series Shrill, and this is from the second episode of the second season, and I'll show the clip now, and then I'll just say a few things about it before I finish. Hopefully it works.
James, really sorry, we can't hear the sound. In order to be able to do that, you would have to stop sharing again. Sorry for that. I forgot about that.
That's okay. Can you hear me
so
still?
if you leave the sharing and then
Yep.
go back into the sharing,
Yep.
and as you share, there is
include
something that
computer
says
sound.
Computer sound, exactly. Thank you.
I can see it now. I mean, I was all set to do a performance of the clip for you if it didn't work, but you've been saved that pleasure.
Oh, that's a pity.
Installing the thing that we're trying to do. And now it's doing it, so that's good. So if I just go back to my window. And hopefully, is that now sharing? Yes, we're in a red border again. Oh, so you can see the screen now, can you, Elka?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Marvelous. Let's carry on.
Sound is very, very low, though.
We're doing as we dumplings. I'll sing for you now, but just know that this is for you. I may not always love you, but long as there are stars above you, you'll never need to doubt it. I'll make you so sure about it. God only knows what I'd be without you. If you should ever leave me, though life would still go on, believe me, the world could show nothing to me. So what good would living do me? God only knows what I'd be without you. God only knows what I'd be without you. If you should ever leave me, the life would still go on, believe me.
I just the song continues through the credits, but I'm just going to move us on because I'm aware of the other speakers and we've had a few technical kerfuffles. So the moment that we saw there seems to capture this potential momentousness and momentariness of television moments. We've got this really familiar song, God Only Knows, which is used quite frequently in television, but it's given this fresh emotional intensity through Peter Smith's performance of it in this moment. And that emotional intensity extends to the lead characters as they, like us, watch the performance that's taking place. Now, it's true that the moment seems to draw together both characters' storylines and perspectives in the show. And if you haven't seen the show, they've previously struggled to vocalize those perspectives. And here it seems to give that moment of clarity, that moment of realization. But the culmination's not overplayed. We just have this simple handhold between the characters. There's no eye contact. And then suddenly those credits are rolling and the song continues through the credits for another 50 seconds and then we're out. And actually that relates to this kind of momentariness. You know, you have this momentous moment and then it's moved on from, we're back into the television landscape, of the flow of the television landscape. Now, when I was watching this for the first time on television, I really felt that this moment stood out from the texture and tone of the episode. It seemed very different. And it stood out really from my experience of Shrill overall, the series. It kind of seemed to come out of nowhere as this standalone moment of accomplished performance. But at the same time, as well as it standing out, it draws us back to the show as a whole. It invites us to reflect on the characters' lives, and it really asks us to read their responses in this moment and to make draw conclusions about that as we might be inclined to do. So, like all television moments, this one from Shrill provides us with choices about how far we push out the boundaries of the moment's resonance, from the moment to the sequence, to the episode, to the season, to the show as a whole, perhaps. And a choice will always remain to stay with the moment, to explore it in detail, to evaluate its aesthetic composition, what aspects of that are contributing to the sorts of senses and feelings that I found when I was watching it. Now, in teaching, knowing those parameters, what we want to achieve by looking at a moment can be really important. Moments can provide that point of common ground within a classroom and can open up wider discussions for us, assuming everyone's got access to enable those discussions, of course. And talking about moments can lead to an exploration of both the intensity and the span of television texts, that intensity within the moment, and then that span that opens out from the moment to consider those wider concerns. So we can stay within the moment, but we can also let the moment take us somewhere else to debate wider matters. Okay, I will finish there. Thank you very much. As I say, I don't think I've said anything startling or original here, but hopefully I've given a bit of an opportunity to reflect on some of the things that we are doing in our teaching of television. Now I need to work out how to stop sharing my screen. Or maybe I've already done it. Elka, am I still sharing?
We can still see your screen.
Oh, I'll press the cross. Hang on.
Yes, exactly. Stop the. If you click the cross, then we're back. Thank you.
I've had a really good Teams tutorial. Thank you.
I think we've got to move on with. Thank you very much, James. This was a really interesting paper, and I have quite a few questions already, but we keep them to the end. Instead, we move on to Paul. Paul Grange from the University of Nottingham, where he's a professor in film and television. Paul has just finished a book on cars and television and cars within the Edinburgh University Press series of television and. But he's also published quite widely, and I use his work widely for that. In relation to branding and television, particularly as television moves into the digital age. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks a lot, Elka, and it's just been a pleasure to be part of this slow conference. It's such a good idea, and it's nice to see everyone here today. I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to talk about metaphors, actually. This is really where my new work, I think, is going, and they should invent a metaphor for the blind panic that can happen when you're hoping it shows. So I'm hoping, Elka, you can see that?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. Okay. So I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes. It's an exploratory paper, and I'm really just wanting some, like James, I think, just a format for just some discussion around a topic that I'm trying to think through. So a couple of years ago, I gave a paper on metaphors used in TV management talk, and this was really specifically the metaphors used by the BBC to think about media streaming. So this is, from talk of players and portals to curation and platform mobility. And really since then, I've developed a mild obsession with media industry metaphors, and I'm beginning to see this really as a project in its own right. So not simply the metaphors used by TV managers, but the array of metaphors that abound in the lexicon of the media industries, but also the language used by TV and media industries research, really to organise thinking about forms, technologies, practices and behaviours. And I've really got to confess, I'm starting to read academic work differently now. I'm not just reading for the argument anymore. I'm really reading for the metaphor. So my note-taking, if you like, has become a process of underlining features of language. Now, sometimes metaphors are coined to help develop critical thinking about certain areas of media practice. Annette Hill, for example, she begins her book on media experiences with this extended topographical metaphor about roaming audiences. She talks about the pathways and tracks people make as they crisscross the media landscape. Now, at other times, metaphors engage with language baked into cultural and industrial vocabularies. So in Netflix Nations, Roman Lobato provides absolute metaphoric payload when he writes the following single sentence: Netflix is closed, library-like, professional, a portal rather than a platform, a walled garden rather than an open marketplace. Now, my metaphor detector pencil went completely berserk at this point, and I know that part of Ramon's point is to suggest that one of the challenges of studying the geography of services like Netflix is that we lack an adequate vocabulary to describe the space and scale of digital media. Considering the geographical configurations of online television, he reflects, and I'm quoting now, perhaps it may be better imagine Netflix as a loose mesh, one that is full of gaps, that comes into contact unevenly with local or national surfaces, or alternatively as a cluster of networks similar to shipping route maps. Now, if he goes on to say, part of the job of global television research over the next decade should be to invent alternative analytic vocabularies that might better reflect this changing landscape, I would suggest this is a task of metaphor to a significant degree. Now, in their seminal study, Metaphors We Live By, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson suggest the following. They say metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language, but in thought and action. Our ordinary conceptual systems, in terms of which we both think and act, is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. Now, this is patently the case in the domain of media and TV and media industry analysis. Now, sometimes metaphors are clearly used to catalyse new ways of theorising. I mean, there's loads of these I could point to: spreadable media, signal traffic, and so on. And sometimes they derive from the discursive engine of particular industrial cultures, and in particularly, Hollywood and Silicon Valley are the obvious ones here. Now, business-facing books like Valley Speak that you can see on the screen have been expressly written to decipher the metaphoric jargon of North California business culture, terms of which are routinely invoked in media analysis, whether hacking or crowdsourcing. Now, Wallace Stevens spoke of metaphor as the creation of resemblance by imagination. And while metaphor is extensively discussed in literature, in linguistics, philosophy, in certain areas of communication research, advertising in particular, it's been taken up, I think, less deliberately within media industry studies as an object of analysis. Now, TV and media industry critics are certainly highly reflexive about the life and effects of metaphors in use. Television studies, for example, has been propelled by metaphoric allusions to water in the critical discussion of flow, channels, currents, and streaming. Now, when metaphor has become an object of study, it's often from a position that tests how metaphor creates ways of seeing and not seeing. Tarleton Gillespie's work on the politics of the term platform, I think, is quite a widely cited example of this approach. Now, writing in 2010, at the point at which companies like YouTube and Facebook were beginning to use the term, he said, a metaphor like platform does not drop from the sky. It is drawn from available cultural vocabulary by stakeholders with specific aims and carefully massaged so as to have particular resonance for particular audiences inside particular discourses. And it's always interesting to see the metaphors that critics use to discuss metaphor, the whole idea of something being carefully massaged. Kind of my little metaphor detector pencil was going crazy there too. Now, what Tarleton did in 2017 is revisit the metaphor of the platform, when really the term had become fully integrated into the language of social media. And he points even more deliberately to what the concept hides, the fact that platforms are not flat, they require labour to produce, they're not neutral, but involve questions of public responsibility. Now, Gillespie makes the point that we needn't simply discard this metaphor to replace it with another term, but he does invite play with different metaphors. And he asks if platforms are perhaps also shopping malls, amusement parks, vending machines, nests, or hives. Josie van Dijk has done something similar with the admittedly imperfect metaphor of platform as pizza. She calls it an imperfect metaphor, so she's being playful. But what she does is elaborate gastronomic power relationships between dough, pre-baked by the big five American platform companies, and toppings that are stacked on by individuals, organizations, and governments. Now, media scholarship that foregrounds metaphor tends to focus on the political baggage that particular concepts convey, certainly those associated with digital technoculture. The metaphor of the cloud, for instance, has been examined by Jennifer Holt and Patrick Vonderow as a celestial panacea, a marketing concept that renders the physical realities of data storage into what they call a palatable abstraction. Metaphors of binging are equally familiar in cultural vocabularies around media use, as we heard from Rob Watts in a panel earlier this week. Marique Jenner and Graham Turner, among others, examining how this term freights understanding of television viewing in terms of addiction and pathology and other things. Now, at stake in these examples is the conceptual path dependence that metaphors generate and the assumptions and values they can lock in. Now, my own question is how we might approach metaphor in TV and media industry studies beyond listing them or pointing to the discursive politics of individual metaphors. And of course, my first way of addressing this was precisely to compile a list, to invoke a metaphor, and they're absolutely everywhere. I just wanted to have a little brainstorm in my own mind and ask some questions. I suppose my questions were, well, what media industry metaphors are prevalent or have been so in the past? How have they been used and by who? Are they derived from industrial or academic talk? What gives a metaphor currency at a specific juncture, and when and how might this change? Are there patterns between metaphors or groupings of metaphor? I had on this slide some visuals actually of logos. You know, I love a logo. So I had the DreamWorks and the NBC Peacock logo to think about visual metaphor. I wondered if that might have gone against the IP things of putting this video on YouTube. So they're not there, but we might think about visual metaphors we encounter. Now, Corpus linguistics approach would be much more systematic, examining metaphor in discourse, but I wanted to give myself a springboard for some early thought. And, you know, within my informal lists, certain patterns did seem to emerge, from the persistence of water and agricultural metaphors to images of digital mining, pipelines and traffic management. And while it's tempting to find metaphoric clusters, Lakoff and Johnson remind us that the ordinary conceptual systems by which we think and act are often extended by many inconsistent metaphors. And they say that our conceptual systems are not consistent overall, since the metaphors used to reason about concepts may be inconsistent. I mean, in the conceptual domain of TV and media industry studies, we often shuttle between metaphors that certainly connect, but that can also slip and collide. Now, one approach to metaphor that I would suggest has value for TV and media industry studies, teaching and research, comes from organisation theory, specifically the influential work of Gareth Morgan, who I'd not heard of until I did a strategic leaders program at my own university. And I realized there was this whole world of discussing metaphor in organizational terms that just got me thinking about how it might apply. Now, like others, he suggests that the importance of metaphor lies in what it allows people to see, understand, and do, and not in the abstract characteristics of the metaphor itself. He warns against an excessive concern for classification because it can place too much emphasis on the epistemological aspects of metaphor rather than its role in the process through which people make sense of their world. That said, Morgan does propose relations and hierarchies between metaphors. Specifically, he looks at root metaphors that help stimulate the development of sub-metaphors. And he published this book in 1986 called Images of Organization. And he identified 8 generative metaphors that seem relevant to his field, which is organization theory. And he said that organizations tend to cast themselves as machines, organisms, brains, cultures, political systems, or more radically, psychic prisons. Now, my point isn't to examine these metaphors or even get into the world of Morgan and organization theory, but I think his broader point is interesting, which is about the capacity of metaphor to produce conflicting insights. He believes in the creative potential of metaphor to think about complex phenomena in open and pluralistic ways. Now, this is not an invitation to come up with endless new metaphors, but to think about the variety of media industry metaphors we live by and the way these develop, adapt, compete, and sometimes petrify. Now, the connection of metaphor to plurality and paradox is apt, I think, when thinking about the disciplinary field of media industry studies, which of course TV studies is centrally talks to. It's for this reason that I want to end this paper by reflecting really briefly on the process of reading for the metaphor in the invited think pieces of the inaugural issue of Media Industries Journal in 2014. And this was a collection of 36 short essays by TV, film and media scholars that really act as a site for the production of disciplinary metaphor. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, media genres become a metaphoric touchstone for historical and contemporary field reflection. David Hessenhaus, for instance, points to the critical versus administrative soap opera of early social and media research. Continuing popular culture illusions, Amanda Lotz argues that TV production studies, media sociology and the like should not be considered to be in some competitive death match to become the approach to media industry study. Now, there's a metaphoric theme here that draws on media genre to dramatize field histories and approaches. Denise Mann invoking the unregulated wild digital West in the title of her reflection on labour practice in the film and TV industries. Now, within many of the think pieces, there is a metaphoric working through of what media industries is as an object and field of debate. Concepts slide quickly in this respect from allegories of genre to metaphors of navigation. Now, James Swatch refers elliptically in this mode to the two worlds of research in a really playful rumination on the conceptual entrapments of research boundaries. So, quantitative versus qualitative, humanities versus social science, and so on. And he writes very tongue-in-cheek, if navigating the two worlds is a familiar challenge of research, and it is for many, having a bigger set of two worlds to choose from might increase your ability to find at any given moment one particular set of two worlds that can be successfully navigated. And I'm sure we can all think of that kind of two worlds binary that you sometimes can get locked into. So he's very much trying to think about that part of our intellectual endeavor, I suppose. But the navigational enterprise has become a more general call for plurality, I think, in finding critical and metaphoric vantage points. Dan Herbert, Amanda Lotz, and Aswin Punathan-Baker used the metaphor of levels to indicate perspectives at various heights to studying media industries. They write, another way we might understand levels is to offer different vantage points in the same way the surface of the Earth appears differently from space, a jet at 30,000 feet, a helicopter, a tall building, or when standing on the ground. This ground to sky imagery chimes with other critics who have called on scholars to think about critical views ranging from dirt research to cultures in orbit. Now, all of this points to something that Martin Barker has written about in a fascinating recent article in Television and New Media, that defining fields of study and models and expectations of research within those fields often involves unstable and debated metaphors and ontologies. Now, this paper, as I'm sure you've realised, is exploratory. I've got a sense that we could point to governing metaphors in TV and media industry discourse from which other concepts develop. Media as environment, perhaps, as economy, as consumption, as disruption. At this stage, I'm just struck with the elaboration of metaphor in talk about media industries, and also the way that metaphors have biographies. For example, the conceptual and metaphoric movement from broadcasting to streaming, from blockbuster to content. The inaugural issue of Media Industries Journal deploys a host of metaphors that imagine disciplinary enterprise as melodrama, terrain, navigation, and toolkit. In an earlier reflection on the conceptual iconoclasm of media industries as a flourishing field, Michelle Hilmes spoke of the slipperiness of defining media industry terminology and the object of study, saying it's like nailing mercury. Now, if this paper responds to an itch I have about metaphor and represents a form of head scratching on my part, I really do welcome your own diagnosis of the TV and media industry metaphors that we live by. Thanks, Alka. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you very much for that. It was also an amazing paper, really interesting questions that you raised there. And I agree totally with you about Martin's paper, which is one of my favorite ones that I use for teaching. So our final speaker in this panel is Mike Wayne, who is at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And he obviously has published widely on global streaming platforms such as Netflix, particularly in relation to branding. So he's done a lot of work in particular on how Netflix has been branded in Israel versus Spain. So he's been working with Deborah Castro on this, for example. And I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Elvie. Hopefully you all can see my slides. So today
Yes.
I'm presenting a paper titled Teaching Television Industry Research Practices, Methodological and Pedagogical Challenges. Given the difficulties associated with accessing decision makers, producers, creative talent, scholarship exploring television industry research often relies on a variety of sources, including annual reports, press releases, sometimes court proceedings, third-party industry reports, trade press, et cetera, et cetera. Like these wide-ranging materials themselves, as we just heard, this approach is often described as media industry studies. For scholars, our ability to publish meaningful work in this vein is dependent on our ability to use our experience and knowledge of these sources to critically unpack their contents. But as Amanda Lotes observes, helping our students develop the chops to effectively read and use such materials is a separate challenge. So today, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the issues I encountered while teaching a master's level research workshop with the goal of helping students learn how to conduct streaming industry research with publicly available secondary data. So the workshop itself was titled Production Culture in the Streaming Industries, and it's an elective that's part of a one-year MA program in media and creative industries. The main goal of the workshop was to help students overcome the challenges of accessing decision makers, which we frequently kind of describe as the production culture approach. Students learn how to gather and analyze relevant data about the streaming industries. They formulate a research question before developing a qualitative design. Then, after data is collected and analyzed, they work over the course of the term to produce a final research paper. So the way I go about helping students learn how to do this is through a 4-step process that starts with a conceptual approach to identifying an object of analysis. In step 2, students locate sources, find materials, et cetera, et cetera. In step 3, I address practical challenges of working with this kind of material. And then in step 4, talk about data analysis and argumentation. But today, I would just like to focus on the first 2 steps of this process, and I'll use some of the seminar slides I used during the course to illustrate how I go about it. So, the majority of the first week of the course, after introductions and that kind of thing, I spend addressing what it means to identify an object of analysis in industry research, which the students need to craft an appropriate research question. So after walking the students through qualitative research questions and media studies more generally, I explained that in the context of the workshop, several decisions have been made for them. So in terms of level of analysis, right, they're looking at organizations in industrial contexts. In terms of their object of analysis, it can be either industry practice or industry discourse. And in terms of the data, they're using publicly available secondary data. Then I provide example research questions from my own work. The goal is to make clear, if somewhat artificially, the distinction between what streaming companies do and what streaming companies say. As I found out, industrial practice tends to be easier to conceptualize. On the bottom left, we see an example of a research question, right, where Netflix either has relationships with multi-channel providers or they don't. Discourse, a little bit tougher. Here we can see an example from a paper that was just published in Media, Culture, and Society about Netflix's efforts to redefine successful television in a streaming environment. I thought the students had a good grasp on this, but their first assignments indicated otherwise. So later in the term, I returned to this issue using an example from Warner Media CEO Jason Clark. I'm sure many of you know that last November, Warner Media announced that the Wonder Woman sequel would be released on HBO Max and in theaters on the same day. So how did I go about kind of parsing the practice from the discourse? I know there are a lot of words on this slide, but I'll try to focus on the technique rather than the specifics. What I did here was, use the colors to differentiate practice from discourse. This is the text of Clark's blog post, which I believe was on Medium. We can see in red that I identify the new distribution strategy, clearly from theater release to combination hybrid theater streaming. And then I identify several kind of strains of discourse surrounding the shift. In blue, we can see, comments related to either theatrical exhibition or theatrical experience. In green, we see claims related to, newness, exceptionality, some of which created by the conditions of the pandemic. And then in purple, we see, a bunch of claims regarding the value of this, shifting strategy for fans. This blog post was, I believe, late November. Like 2 weeks later, Warner Media announced that they were expanding the strategy, and so I could update the application of this, again, in red, we see the same strategy, but then discursively, several of the strains, 2 of the 3 strains have kind of fallen away. And now, right, the streaming release, the streaming simultaneous theatrical release is presented centrally as a benefit, for fans. And I think after this work, students, this was certainly useful in kind of illustrating exactly what practice and discourse look like, in the context of the data that is accessible. Moving ahead to the second issue that I'd like to discuss today, which is helping students locate relevant data. So I start by emphasizing the need to avoid irrelevant data. Here we can see a fake tweet, supposedly from Netflix, claiming that their content is now pedophile free. Although the context is important here, the fake tweet is a reference to the controversy surrounding Netflix's film Cuties and was produced by an Onion-like satiric website. Common sense dictates that the world's most popular streaming service probably won't promote their content in such a way. In addition, and this of course is not special to my students or our students, but as a kind of broader problem, there's a need for media literacy regarding all online information in the context of the course. I try to emphasize the need to be wary of misleading industry information, and a particular problematic source for this is Statista. This is a hill I'm willing to die on, rightly or wrongly. Here we can see a typical graph from Statista with its typically kind of useless and misleading information. Claim is that 4.5 million subscribers, Netflix had 4.5 million subscribers in France in December 2018. What happens when you click on the show sources link? Of course, they ask you for money. So I take a hard line on this. Do not cite Statista. In the case of this particular statistic, in 2018, Netflix only publicized 2 subscriber numbers, so the total subs for the US and Canada and the total subs for everywhere else. So the goal of this example is to demonstrate the need for students to stay away from information that they don't understand. As I put it in the slide, if you can't explain it, you can't use it. Moving ahead to actual useful sources of information, I define the best place to look in 2 categories: official materials and press coverage. Here we can see the list of references from one of my articles with each identified. For official materials, I identify 2 types: public relations and investor relations. The benefit of official materials is that they're publicly available. As of course many of us know, a press release is not produced without being read by lawyers and marketing executives and communication professionals, and these people don't really make mistakes at this level. Nonetheless, official materials, as Caldwell told us 20 years ago, are the things a company says about itself, and we should not give them too much power. Or as Milhouse would put it, my mom says I'm cool. And I walk students through using in public relations and investor relations websites, with Netflix as an example. Of course, particularly for press releases, these are not perfect archives. Press releases disappear depending on the way the winds are blowing. Nonetheless, this is a useful source of information. The second broad category of material that's useful for this kind of work is press coverage. I use Alyssa Perrin's work very frequently when I teach this, I start by noting that with the exception of damaging investigative reporting, press coverage of streaming services is not critical. It promotes the company's image of itself. Journalists in every field need access, and so the tendency for journalists who go too hard is to lose access, which limits their ability to produce the kind of work that is most beneficial for their careers. In terms of the types of press coverage, I distinguish between the trade press and the popular press. And I try to help my students understand that press coverage is frequently a less official version of what a company says about itself. The responses from other industry players are particularly valuable, although the kind of third-party analysis from Wall Street types is not useful secondary data in and of itself. One of the challenges my students experience with press coverage is getting to the source, finding the most reputable material. This is a particular problem because useful information is often available in multiple places. And so the way I position this is that the most reputable sources are those closest to the industry. And so there are gray areas, but a trade press article is better, in a hierarchical sense, a superior source than a content aggregator is. It was very challenging for my students to kind of be able to parse out, the relevant sourcing when the same piece of information here we can see, several headlines about, the third season of Money Heist, available from multiple places, some of which, Variety being, significantly more reputable than aggregator websites. And then, of course, there are kind of multiple levels to this, right? If our goal is to get as close to the industry as possible, then, the trade press is good, but maybe we can get closer. Of course, right, the trades can function as mouthpieces, and as Alyssa Perrin work on this is excellent. The trades and the industry are part of the same ecosystem. And so, the trade presses are subject to the same set of economic forces that are creating all kinds of problems across journalism more broadly. And again, the highest kind of value here is proximity to the industry. Therefore, again, there are gray areas, but in general, press releases are better citations, are better sources than a trade press report that simply reproduces the same information. So overall, when working with the trades, I emphasize that it's not easy and that there are no shortcuts. I also use Herbert et al.'s excellent introduction, media studies, because the levels of analysis highlight so usefully the need to, both become familiar with the relevant publications, the relevant companies, the relevant individuals. I advise my students to start following the companies they care about in the trades every day. You should approach this deliberately and be rigorous in their reading, which for those who have never done this kind of work before, I think is a very effective way of catching up more quickly rather than more slowly. So to wrap up, my students responded to the workshop positively, although several noted the challenging nature of this kind of work. On one hand, it's difficult for master's students to acquire industry-specific knowledge when for many this work isn't going to be related to what they're doing their thesis projects on. Nonetheless, I think that the workshop really helped them develop some critical methodological skills that they did carry forward into their theses and into other things. In their papers, the students addressed a variety of streaming industries, which I interpret as a signal that my television industry specific approach was useful, that this kind of thinking readily transfers to other industries. As a teacher, of course, my familiarity with specific, Western television industries is an issue. I felt this in my inability to help students who are working on, streaming companies in non-Western contexts. It was just harder for me to kind of guide them through their research process. But nonetheless, the workshop I felt was very successful. Overall, ultimately, this was a very useful kind of endeavor in taking, pulling back the veil from industry research and breaking it down into its, component parts, and delivering this information, to master's students. So in that sense, it was quite successful. So with that, I will wrap it up, and I look forward to your questions and an interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Mike. I really liked what Brett did on Wednesday, which was basically to invite everyone to now share their camera so that our speakers don't have to look at just black pictures. Can I ask you ask you a question either by the chat or by raising your hand, please? Derek.
Hi, thanks everyone for really interesting papers. This is sort of talk about pedagogy that I've been missing. I particularly wanted to go back to James's, and as Brett commented in the chat about how this is a lot of the things that we all have to deal with all of the time. One of the things that really stood out for me, and I wonder if this is something we can discuss or people have ideas about, is how people deal with the need for additional knowledge. When you were talking about moments, I was thinking about some of the moments that really stand out for me and how much they depend, particularly in serialized dramas, on potentially years. And so you're showing something to students and you go, oh, what a great moment, and it's all right, because they don't have that relationship. And I suppose this is then drawing out some of how the emotional is part of it and how we analyze that. So yeah, I am aware, less of a question, more of a comment, but I think really useful in helping draw that out. And I wonder if there are ways that you've tried to tackle that, or if you've got advice.
Well, should I respond now? Is that okay? Yeah. I completely agree. What you're describing there, Derek, when you feel that something is pivotal to the whole experience of a show, and then that moment where students kind of shrug and sort of go, because there's that, not that investment in it, but actually you can have it a different way where a cohort of students will have that experience of an entire show and another cohort of students won't. So the other danger is that you get this disparity within the room of how people are responding to it. And so, I mean, for me, I think the parameters of what you're wanting to explore with the use of a moment in the classroom are really important. And actually kind of loading that kind of expectation onto it if you can, and maybe starting with the specific and broadening out from there is one way of approaching it. I think it's true with long-running serial drama. I think it's always and continues to be true with soap opera as well. And the need to articulate, or the desire to articulate, the achievement in soap opera relies on articulating something about the emotional attachment that is created between audiences and the text over 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And so actually, and especially as soap operas tend to revisit their own histories in quite resonant and meaningful ways, I think it would be useful if soap opera was talked about more in relation to these sorts of issues as well. But I completely agree with everything that you've said, Derek, and it's a really good point.
And just to quickly follow up. Oh, echo. It struck me that that concern is actually emphasising how we focus so much on narrative. Rather than aesthetics or so on, but how we keep coming back to the That's an interesting thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did have, in the many different chimera versions of the paper, there was a slide using Todorov's 5 stages of narrative. It's interesting, even when I've taught things like news programming, and subconsciously dividing it into this beginning, middle and end of a news broadcast to give this narrative shape to it, which is true and it is there. But I think there's something hardwired into the way that we're using moments there that's quite interesting.
Thank you. Claire is asking a question via the chat. She apologises she has no camera today, but says thank you to all speakers, but has a question for James again. What are the limits to your tolerance, James, for not doing spoilers? At Amsterdam University, they agreed that there are no spoilers in the world of television academics. This leads to some awkward moments. So what is your tolerance?
Well, I mean, I think other people can jump in here. I think I've developed a very kind of clunky way of dealing with this. And as I look through modules that I'm teaching or courses that I'm teaching, I tend to go for episodes quite near the beginning to sort of, which is one strategy, but which is a kind of stupid strategy, because so many shows get better as they go along, and we all know a show that we've enjoyed that we kind of advise people get through the first season and then it really picks up. So it's not really a very good strategy at all. I think that idea of there are no spoilers is really interesting and people can talk about that. I think making available to students in advance the opportunity and giving them time to familiarise themselves with a text as a whole is the best that we can do. But I suppose I'm a little bit more sensitive about spoiling viewer experiences, but other people might have ideas.
Actually, Paul commented on this briefly in the chat. Do you want to? Well, not so much spoilers, but more the question of narrative, isn't it? At the middle and end and promotional material. Do you want to say anything about that, Paul?
No, it was a throwaway comment, really, but I've always been drawn to shortness for some of, I mean, because I like the forms themselves, actually. I think they're much richer than people have traditionally given them credit for, but also actually because it does solve a pedagogical problem in a really short 50-minute classroom, I suppose. I mean, if I've just, as you've introduced the question, actually, can I ask one of James Elker? Is that okay? I know other people have got their hands up. I mean, I really enjoy both papers. I mean, I suppose the thing that jumped for me, James, when you were talking about are we equipped for teaching from different platforms, and obviously that's become a massive issue in the last 18 months. And I've, been witnessing the conversations in my own department where I suppose film and TV lists have changed because we can't play the materials in a classroom. We have to rely on navigating what kind of IP and copyright issues and licenses our universities have got. So we, for the first time, have asked people just to watch things on Netflix, or, and that obviously depends on what's available in any one week. So, I mean, that question about are we equipped for different providers in the current landscape? I'd love to know how you've dealt with that, or what that opens up actually in terms of the archive and teaching, in terms of licenses and stuff.
Well, for me personally, this year with the pandemic, I changed my screenings quite a lot to only include material that was available through Freeview and through Boxer Broadcasts, so that students weren't required to pay any money. I found ways around that when I had them in person, but I couldn't find ways around that when I was doing it remotely. And our university didn't sort out the actual very simple copyright issue of making content available, and that, there are ways of doing that. But then you get into all sorts of other things. If you want to show material from Netflix, that you download a Netflix recorder, and which I don't think can be legal, but that's a way of doing it. And you work out how to do screen recording and all those sorts of things. I think the point there is that in terms of the number of platforms that are available to watch content on, each of those comes with a price tag. And it's a price tag for students, but very often it's a price tag for academics as well. And if you were a literature teacher, I think the expectation that you would buy all those copies of those books and distribute them to your students in order for them to study the subject would be kind of laughable. And actually, if you're a film academic, I don't think there would be that expectation either. But for television teachers, there's this sort of, in my experience, blindness to what television actually is, what's important to teach, and what's just common sense in terms of what you want to teach. And so actually there is a cost, a financial cost to academics, as well as a time cost in being able to curate those materials and make them available for students, that personally I just don't think is talked about much.
Very important point. I want to hand over to the people who've raised their hands. So the first person who raised their hand was Christine. So Christine, if you want to ask a question. Christine, you're muted.
Sorry, I don't teach online, so I'm not used to it. A really interesting panel, and Paul's paper got me thinking about metaphors of teaching, which of course Zoom actually foregrounds, and the kind of conversation which is possible. And so it struck me that the three of you are maybe talking about different kinds of pedagogy, different kinds of relationships between you and your students. And Mike, it seemed to me that your account, which was really interesting, was much more about telling students things that you know are useful, practical, and will work, and transmitting that to them. Whereas maybe James is wanting to do something slightly different, which is somehow engage the students in an experience that he's already had, without spoiling it for them or without telling them what that experience is. Do you see what I mean? So I wondered if the three of you might just comment on different styles of pedagogy and how they work. Big question.
Mike, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. That is a big question. In my experience, a significant portion of, my approach to teaching is course dependent, right? So obviously a nuts and bolts approach to a particular kind of, research technique would be inappropriate in, a second-year elective on television and society or something like this. I teach those kinds of courses too. And the course I was describing, it's a research workshop. You have to walk them through something and help them apply it. The other paper is we're asking really interesting kind of conceptual questions about television itself. And my paper, I'm a television scholar, and so television is the thing that I'm discussing. But my students are talking about Spotify, or they're talking about streaming platforms in contexts that I presume most of us are not familiar with. And so there's a kind of flexibility that I got away with, I think, by centering television, that I'm not sure would work if it was a text-based course. So I hope that begins to answer your question.
My own view. Thanks for the question, Christine. You're always brilliant at elegantly joining a question for 3 papers at once. So you did that marvelously. I mean, my own answer to that, I suppose, is literally by using metaphor as a pedagogical strategy. How could that work? And it kind of links to Mike's paper, actually, in trying to think about the cross-pollination metaphor of language between academic ways of trying to understand the media world we live in and practitioners' understanding of the way their worlds work. And sometimes there's a lot of crossover and deliberate crossover. I mean, when Kathy Johnson and I were working with Red Bee, I mean, the amount of times they were drawing over concepts and metaphors that had been deployed. Largely, it was Henry Jenkins's spreadable stuff, and there's those moments where industry and academic metaphors align, but they can also, I think, diverge. And I suppose that's part of what I took from your paper, Mike, in terms of how our own industrial theorizing relates to sort of that Coldwell deep text, how industry is self-theorizing itself by using a whole kind of vernacular language. I suppose for me, the pedagogy of that is just to sort of surface the way talk influences the way we understand the object, I guess, TV, streaming, or whatever. James, what do you think?
As I fumble to switch my microphone on, I'm showing some of the limitations of access here. Can you all hear me? Yeah, I think, thank you, Christine. I think that's a really good sort of overarching observation. And I think it's true, actually. Sort of knowing what you're doing in the classroom and which of those kind of directions that you've described you're coming from is really important. I think from my perspective, I think it's engaging students in a process of revisiting and rewatching. And yes, as the sort of, I suppose, the seminar leader or the course leader in the room, you're at a different point of that rewatching and revisiting. But actually, to acknowledge that you're part of that process, that you're not coming with a preset conditions for what can or can't be discussed. To link it through to Paul and Mike's papers, I think that with Paul's paper, the idea that there is a language, a common language, whether it's metaphor or whatever, that is useful for articulating the claims that we want to make. But with Mike's paper, that there are standards, we should aim to a standard for the kind of discussion that we want to have. Not that we'll have a standard discussion, but that there are rules and that there are things we will observe to really deepen the claims that we want to make. As you were saying it, Christine, I thought, well, now is there something deceptive going on here? That as a teacher, I know the answers that I have, and then I pretend I don't have those answers when I'm talking to students. And I don't think there's any kind of merit in that whatsoever. I think actually, for me, trying to draw that relationship between that first experience of a moment and then revisiting it. And I always show a television moment a couple of times before we start talking about it, so that something, and they'll have watched it obviously beforehand, before the session as well, so that we are actually now engaging in a different point of engagement that can be quite useful. But actually, I wouldn't want to suggest that I'm doing anything, and you're not suggesting that I'm doing something very different to Mike and Paul in their papers. I think those levels are really important in teaching.
Thank you. The next person to have the hand up is Michael. Samuel.
Hi there. My thoughts are really related to James's paper, but I invite anyone to sort of respond. And in regards to the TV studies-ness of the pedagogical framework for exploring moments on television, and this framework for teaching moments is incredibly exciting and one I've found particularly effective in my own teaching over the years. And part of that excitement of teaching moments as opposed to episodes or series is that invitation to divorce it from sort of narrative altogether, to root it in theories of the affective, the aesthetic, to think about the moment in relation to the overall structures. And if we're talking about TV, of course, that's flow, or ideas of fluidity. Is to root it in art, and which naturally draws from a host of disciplines. So my question, therefore, is: does the proposition of an interpretive, interdisciplinary pedagogical framework in relation to moments jeopardize the specific TV studies dimension of this sort of teaching, or does it signal the sort of our current place and possible future approaches to television studies in its sort of interdisciplinary reach, I guess?
Thanks, Mike. That's a great question. I think there's scope for exactly what you've just described, isn't there? And if we have a rich, diverse thing that television is, that what you were describing about isolating those moments, and could we conceive of disparate moments from all over the place of television that we could analyze with a theoretical, conceptual, or aesthetic from that direction, from those perspectives? I think yes, we could. And I think what we're describing here is, which we all know, a mature and rich art form. And we wouldn't necessarily resist doing that in relation to other art forms. And so there is the scope and the potential for that. But I agree with your caution that's kind of within your question as well. Do we then lose the shape of television? Do we lose the sense of what television is as a medium as well? And so again, it comes back to that point about knowing why you're doing it, knowing why you are isolating or selecting, and what you are omitting in doing that process of selecting, and understanding the importance of putting that perspective back in, or alluding to that perspective, even if it's omitted in the practice that you're engaging with at that point. So that's a little bit cake and eat it, but I think I'm agreeing with both sides of your question there.
Because we're talking about television as a I want to ask Brett to come in here and ask the questions or make the comment that you made in the chat about television as programs or television as flow, schedule, etc.
Thanks, Alka. I think you just asked it for me. So this problem that I guess we all encounter of other than just going, oh, Raymond Williams talked about flow decades ago and doing 15 minutes on that in a lecture. I guess we then all just default back to programs, moments as has been talked about and stuff like that. And it'd be interesting to know, particularly given, students are now structuring their own schedules and all that kind of stuff, how people have kind of dealt with that. Because I know I always end up defaulting to, episodes, scenes, moments, programs, rather than thinking about broadcasting.
Paul, surely you have something to say to that.
It's a great question, Brett. I suppose it sometimes comes down to what kind of approach you're taking to television. I think in my department and with some of my colleagues, we take a very screen industries approach to it, perhaps more than James's, and the conversation is more sort of textual and aesthetic kind of approach. And in thinking about that shift from broadcasting and the schedule and the flow, I suppose you then end up looking at some of the mechanisms, the interfaces actually by which people are engaging with television to try and think through what does broadcasting mean for different people. Let's not assume that people don't watch in a linear fashion, and that needs to be, I think, surfaced constantly, because there's lots of different, not everyone is sort of curating their own Netflix. But I mean, looking at the interfaces of an iPlayer or a Netflix to just trying to think about how content is being, what is the concept of scheduling for a Netflix now? I think I've tended to approach that pedagogically by thinking about the interfaces by which people are sort of engaging with television now, rather than, I suppose, think about the loss of my ability to teach broadcasting as a sort of experience across time.
Mike, do you want to add anything in terms of institution or anything?
I wish I had a different truth than to say that I've largely surrendered to streaming as a mechanism. Try to meet students where they're at, right? And so if you want to talk about linear things that aren't sports, every year it's harder. And so that's the kind of, that's the choice I've made. I don't advocate that choice particularly strongly, other than to, say that's the path I have chosen.
Gabriel was the next person to have the next person to
Sorry, Elke.
But he had to leave. He wanted to ask.
Could I just say something?
Really important.
Sorry, Elke, can I just say something in response to Flo?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
There was just very, very briefly, I think flow still exists, and I think that the concept of self-curation streaming can sometimes be quite ageist. One of the ways of talking about flow for me has been to think about preschool children's television, CBeebies particularly, which to me, when I've watched it repeatedly, incessantly, has those characteristics of flow that we would recognise. And I think if you looked at the Channel 4 schedule this afternoon and looked at the demographic that are watching the Channel 4 schedule this afternoon, you would find that there is still that involvement in flow that we recognise from the Raymond Williams work. And I think sometimes the assumption that people are curating Netflix and those kinds of platforms is a very narrow age band potentially, and excludes the older audience and excludes the younger audience as well. So that was my point.
Great. Yes. So back to Gabriel. So Gabriel had to leave, but he has a really good question, and it's a question that came up before. So I just want to bring it in here again, which is, where does everyone stand in relation to the decolonization question? What does it mean for television studies, for media studies more generally? Is it something we do just by sprinkling some foreign authors or programs into our reading lists, or indeed into our watching lists? So yeah, what are your thoughts there? Who wants to go first? Maybe Mike?
I think Katie had a hand up there actually as well, Elke, for a point.
Do we want to get those two questions together and then just bring that to a close up then? Katie, what was your question? Katie, you're muted.
Of course I am, because I would do. Thanks. I have a million questions following what's been a really interesting conversation and really wide scope from all three papers, expanding, what is this thing that we call television studies? But I kind of tried to jump in there, especially in relation to the decolonizing question, because that, I suppose, of all my questions is the biggest one. And it's a kind of a pre-formed question, because we have at Leicester, the contested institution currently of Leicester, we have a really diverse student cohort. And one thing that I have found when running TV studies is that our students watch such different things. And I actually feel the decolonizing question is a big one. It's an important one, a crucial one right now, but it also does allow us to investigate questions of platform, of access, of preference, of taste. For instance, I would never have known of Korean TV drama had it not been for my students. But I think it's a big question. So how do we decolonize meaningfully, meaning, as Mike just said, meeting people, our students, where they live, in ways that mean that we aren't endlessly ourselves curating all this material? Because I feel like for years, I tried to get out in front of my students and curate material in advance of what their tastes would be, but they're too diverse. There's too many of them. So I've been thinking instead of what that is to say, I can't anticipate, and maybe nor should we. So I'm thinking about ways in which to build on this idea of a viewing diary, which I do, and I have it as an assessment, a portfolio. This is more of a statement, sorry. I'm curious about how we can consider ways to have students bring their favorite content to us more thoroughly. You know, maybe even invite them to screen clips in class, you know, and then choose their moments. So we activate this concept of the moment, which is such a useful one, which I've been using, and I've written about it as well, which just meant I have more theory to draw on. And I feel like the moment is such an emotional punch, and it's useful right by itself. So maybe if we invite students to think of moments, then they can bring their transnational stuff in. But how do you get students to talk meaningfully about their favorite programs if they are not accessible to us? Super long.
Can I jump into that quickly as well? So this is really interesting because Leicester has a very really diverse student population. Edgehill is the exact opposite. We have a very homogenous, very white, very lower working class and lower middle class audience and clientele, and as a result, we are facing the opposite problem. They watch very samey stuff, basically. So this decolonizing question is really complex in terms of precisely thinking about student cohorts in particular. So just wanted to add that complication there as well. So who would like to respond first? Paul?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point, Katie. And I suppose I just put something in the chat that just made me think about that idea of that invitation for students to bring their own things that they're immersed into class. And I think the Cunningham and Craig book, Social Media Entertainment, is a one for us to take some thinking away from, because obviously that whole concept is that there's a new proto industry emerging with its own business models, its own forms of engagement, its own kind of I don't know, vernaculars of authenticity and so forth. If I'm thinking like you, James, and I'm sure you're interested in Channel 4 and CBeebies, maybe that comes from a personal relationship that if you've got children or anything. I mean, my kids, 16 and 11, they're completely immersed in the world of social media entertainment and would not distinguish that from television. In the future of the discipline, that has to be something that we're always looking at, I think. I mean, I've just finished this book, TV and Cars, and I've been reading a lot of Brett's work actually, and a lot of James's. And one of my chapters is Peter Kay's Car Share, but another chapter is Carpool Karaoke. And as a sort of a TV digital hybrid, that becomes is that TV? Does it belong to YouTube? My son would understand that in a completely different way than I would. I would see it as a sort of an extension from a late night talk show. He just actually sees it as something recommended because it relates to a band he likes. So I think there's some fluid ideas about TV and what can be brought into the pedagogical space. I suppose that would be my thought.
Mike, do you want to respond?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the issues involved here differ a little bit when we're talking about industry and when we're talking about texts. Of course, the industrial variations, nationally, transnationally, we can go on and on and on. But I get the sense that television industries, certainly, these days, the kind of even the commercial public kind of hybrid tend to look similar at a level that texts don't necessarily, they don't share. Industry, I think we could expect a more overlap kind of structurally, practically, conceptually than with text. So I don't want to make any pronouncements. Of course, we have a long way to go in terms of expanding the range of, television industries and places where those are situated that we care about. But I'd just like to note that I think the challenges are a little bit different as we move from industry to text.
Really important point, Mike. Thank you. James, do you want to add a last comment?
To take it back to the decolonizing the curriculum, I think that at our institution we have a decolonizing the curriculum group within our school across different subject areas, and I think a properly formulated, well thought out, robust approach to decolonizing the curriculum at institutional level is really crucial, because otherwise we're expecting individual academics to personally take control and responsibility for that, some of whom may not be secure or confident in doing it, and to see the extent to which our teaching aligns with an institutional strategy on decolonizing the curriculum that is official within the institution, that is something that the institution has committed to, and then to take that, which is the way that we're doing it at our university. So there's quite a well formulated approach to how we might do that, after quite a few years of saying, yes, this is very important, and then a gap kind of emerges from it. So that, I think, leads to the sort of transnational points that people have been making here. But I think having that kind of that foundation is really important.
Thank you very much. Really good to see that there is such an institutional approach to this. I have to say, at Birmingham, I don't think we have quite as much elsewhere. Christine made a really good point about, that decolonization could also be understood through the teaching of history of the BBC, for example, or indeed Channel 4, who have obviously been really important in trying to engage with the diversity of audiences within the UK themselves. Sometimes problematically, but nevertheless trying to do so. Right, we have spent quite a lot of time talking, and this is such an interesting conversation, and obviously there's been a few more questions in all responses, amongst others by Katrina in the chat. So Katrina, I'm just going to very, very briefly mention that you said the question of what is television is really important, and the students obviously respond to the question often by saying they don't watch television. That's exactly what they do in my university as well, but they do watch precisely the television content.
I think
want to say something about the hierarchies thing?
Yeah, it was just really to kind of, I suppose, bring in questions of power. I feel like in TV studies, we probably don't talk enough about questions of power. And Paul has responded about the power of trade press to kind of frame some of the industry stuff. And I think that's a really important point as well. And I think the kind of general thing was kind of getting at is some of the discourse of this kind of artificial distinction between streaming and television. Is it problematic? And here I'm thinking about what we're kind of talking about at the moment, about the future of public service broadcasting, the future of Channel 4. Like, for instance, I don't see my students having any kind of a relationship with Channel 4. They will not be the future defenders of Channel 4. They like the content. They like the Michaela Cole stuff. They like the Derry Girl stuff. But in terms of the institution, they have no. And I suppose it's thinking about how these kind of slippages, how these kind of rhetorical moves, what is the kind of consequence of those for questions of power, for questions of policy in the future. And I was just kind of, I thought all three kind of brought that kind of question to the fore a little bit, for me anyway. And it was more of a comment rather than a question. And we've had a discussion. And thanks, Derek, for I could absolutely in that report from Ofcom, I could absolutely hear my own students as well, and how they differentiate between content they see on streaming like Sherlock and don't associate it with the BBC at all. But so yeah, question of power and kind of value hierarchies that are imposed when we distinguish between streaming and TV.
Do you want to respond? No? All good? Yeah. For me, this was a really crucial thing as well. That would have been my question as well, about questions of power. So thank you for raising that. And I think it's something that we need to keep in mind more generally. Can I ask everyone to join in thanking the panelists for this really fantastic panel, really interesting conversations about pedagogic and research, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of Paul's research on metaphors in research and teaching perhaps as well. The next session is obviously on Monday. I hope that by then we'll be able to upload more of the videos onto YouTube, so you will probably get another email from me. I'm also sending an email out about carpool karaoke, because even though we can't be in Liverpool, at least we can all watch carpool karaoke with Paul McCartney, which is my favourite episode, I have to say. So watch that space. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day, and indeed a lovely weekend. And I see you next week. Bye bye.